Okay, I think we're just about ready to start. Beth, would you like to get us started?
I'm assuming you mean Beth Goldfarb.
Either Beth is fine with me. I was actually looking at Beth Ahrens, but
I'll let Beth Ahrens take it.
okay, great. Thanks so much, Beth.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Many of you are aware that we have been working on putting this programming together for some time now. We actually started talking about it in the spring, and it's a joint effort between the Mass Collaborative Law Council, of which I'm the president, and the Mass Council on Family Mediation, of which Justin Kelsey is the president, and the Academy of Professional Family Mediators, of which Michael Orr is the president, and we worked collaboratively to put this together. We feel it's very timely and very important, and we are on a journey of starting some good work to make ourselves more self-aware and to help our organizations grow and be more welcoming and inclusive of our, not only our members, but of also the clientele that we want to make outreach to. So we're very glad to have Dr. David Campt here today to launch us on this journey. This is actually part one of 4 parts of a deeper dive for leadership workshops that we are planning to roll out over the next several months. And they will be available to people who are members and part of the diversity committees of our organizations. At least that's the plan for MCLC and MCFM. I am not as up to date with APFM. So if you are interested in expanding your interaction in these areas, please consider joining the diversity committees of one of the organizations. And now, is Dr. Campt on?
He is. He is
There
on.
he is.
I was waiting for my dramatic entrance.
Go back out and I'll give you a dramatic entrance with a drum roll and everything. We are hot off. This is the beauty and also the terror of the COVID age, right? So we can present with a group in San Antonio, Florida this morning, and then be with you all in the afternoon. And so that's what we're coming off of. So thanks so much for being here with us today. Did Justin want to say anything before we got started? Justin from the other organization?
Sure, I'll just add to what Beth said, that I'm really excited about our organizations launching this work, and I'm glad that we're finally getting it started. It takes some time to put things together with multiple organizations. And like Beth said, I would encourage anyone motivated by today's presentation to get more involved on the committees of each organization that are working on this. We need more people in our leadership who are interested in spreading a message of inclusion and equity, within our community organizations, but also beyond to the community dispute resolution in general. And that's what we hope to start with today.
Okay. So,
Allison,
yeah.
Darcia, who can represent APFM, is on. If she wants to say a couple of words, Michael, president of APFM.
I got you.
Join yet?
Super. Okay, go ahead.
So I just put Darcy on the spot. She doesn't know I was doing that. But I figured since the other 2 organizations.
Thank you very much. I think we'll let Michael speak this morning.
But I don't think he's on, Darcia.
Okay, he's not on yet. Okay, well, on behalf of the APFM, I want to say thank you for everyone that's attending. I know our association is trying to make some major changes in that area. I'm not going to say much right now because I am not ready to be seen. So thank you, and looking forward to hearing the keynote.
Okay, well, thank you all so much. And I will take it from here. My name is Allison Mahaley, and I am with the Dialogue Company. I've had the pleasure of working with Dr. Campt for the last 2 years. as we embark on this this journey, really to change the world, one of the things that you guys are all very aware of that happened this summer between the protests and the pandemics, we have seen an enormous outpouring of interest in people getting more astute in their ability to address diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so answering that call has been a little bit overwhelming for us as a very small business, but it has also been incredibly exciting and fulfilling. And so we're really excited about this partnership that you all have put together to bring Dr. Campt's message to a larger audience and to give people the opportunity to dig in even deeper to these incredibly important issues. On that note, I am going to share, I'm going to share a little bit about Dr. Campt. Dr. Campt was born in Detroit, Michigan. He always says I'm linear, so I start at the beginning. He was born in Detroit, Michigan, and he was born into a family as an only child. And I'm always telling him that says so much about who he is and how he shows up in the world, because I was born to a family of a lot of children, and it's a very different perspective on the world. Dr. Campt graduated high school and then went to Princeton, where he studied computer science. And then he got his graduate degrees from UC Berkeley, where he studied public policy and city planning. And that led him straight into a position in Bill Clinton's White House, where he was part of the original conversations on race back in the 90s. David has always been committed to this idea that we need to talk more and debate less, that the heart of changing this nation is in the art of conversation and us truly getting to know one another. David is an adept facilitator. He's a dynamic speaker, and I'm happy to say that he has become one of my dear friends. So with no further ado, we will let Dr. Campt take it over and start sharing his presentation.
All right. Thanks so much, Allison, and thanks, Beth, and thanks, everybody. So I appreciate the time to talk with y'all today. I first got to know y'all, the extended family, at the ICP, International Association of Collaborative Professionals, in October of 2019, and I felt, wow, these people are part of my tribe. Like, I really was so happy to be there, and so I'm happy to be with y'all today, continuing the conversation about unconscious bias, which I think is one of the most important and under-discussed issues in our society. If we're going to create a better nation that is more united and it works better for everybody, it's important to look at what is going on between us and even within us that impedes that. We have a lot of challenges ahead of us, but certainly this issue around how do we see each other and what are the drivers of that, and what are the ways in which we do that that might not be as productive to our goal of success, both for ourselves personally, for our organizations, and for the nation. We have to figure this out. And I think that unconscious bias is a key issue in that. And so I'm grateful for the chance to share some thoughts about that. So Allison is going to run the PowerPoint deck. So we're going to be going back and forth on that. So
She is? I thought you were. Okay, I got you.
You got it? Okay. Okay. So if we could start out with share that deck. Start with the first slide. Actually, the second one. So as she brings it up, my interest in this issue, how people get along, started with I think in the 4th grade. I had a social studies teacher named Mr. Nathan Fine, and Mr. Fine used to teach us social studies and teach us about how to all these cultures around the world. And that's what social studies teacher's job is. But he would always remind us that people are more alike than they are different. I think that the reason he was doing that is because this was in Detroit in the early 70s, and there was a lot of conflict in the society. We were on the verge of electing our first Black mayor. You can imagine the controversy around that at the time. And there was, it was Mr. Fine. Mr. Fine is actually still alive. I just discovered that. He's like 89 now. And there were a lot of conflicts in the society. We had a case about forced busing that went to the Supreme Court. You can see that is a picture of one of the rallies where somebody who did not want their children to be forcibly bused. Next slide. So that's another example. So there was a lot of conflict. And on the other hand, of course, there were Black people who were saying that 25 years after Brown versus Board, it is time for us to really make equal opportunity real. Next slide. So that's so you can see the conflict there. So I became interested as a kid in this issue of how are people, what's the degree to which people are similar or different? Mr. Fine used to tell us to say, you have to have a say, like people are more alike than they are different. So on the one hand, Mr. Fine is saying that, and on the other hand, I'm seeing that adults don't necessarily think like that. So that question of to what extent people are more alike, they're different, and how do we talk about those has become very intriguing to me. So next slide. So I think that it's important for us to try to get a handle on some our racial disputes in the US. And so I want to offer forward a couple ideas about that as the context for this discussion about unconscious bias. Next one. So I think that the fact of the matter is, we really get honest about it. Part of what we're dealing with and have always been dealing with in our society is this question of why are people of color, especially Black people, but also Latinos, Native Americans, et cetera, maybe Asians too, why are they disadvantaged in so many dimensions, whether it's housing, whether it's employment, whether it's incarceration? Why is that is a question that we're all thinking about. So I think given how stark that is, that it's a question that is in the back of all of our minds, people from the far left to far right. And on a basic level, there's only three possibilities. The reason that is happening is because of racism that's happening right now. The reason that's happening is because of the effects of racism in the past. And then the question lurking in the background that only the racists like to talk about is something is wrong with those people. There's not many options about why these disadvantages happen. What is going on with that? So part of what I think that we're grappling with is how do we think about those questions in light of, some of us say, the possibility that we're taught, number three, at least, we're taught that something is wrong with them. And that's the reason why they're in the condition they're in, and that we should find it acceptable. Now, some people reject that explicitly. Some people on the far right, white nationalists, embrace that as the truth. But I would just offer that part of what we're all wrestling with is what I call the other man versus the brother man question, to explain what is going on with the fact that people of color, Black people primarily, but not primarily, but most obviously, but also others, why are they so disadvantaged? You don't have many options for why that might be. So part of what we're wrestling with as society are these questions. Next slide. Now, another way of reframing that might be useful to you as you're trying to talk about these issues is I think that the racial discussion in our country comes down to really three questions. Can people be perpetuating racism without intending to? That's the same question as, does unconscious bias exist? That's the same question as, does white privilege, or I don't even like that term, I like to call it unearned racial advantage, because as a workshop participant said, both the white and the privileged trigger people, but whatever, is there something that is to the idea of being in a group in which you're not subject to that kind of bias? That's one question. Can people perpetuate racism without intending to? A second question is, do the racist structures of the past affect conditions today? Even your most virulent racist would say, yes, slavery was a problem and it existed. But the question is, or at least one question is, do the racism of the past, slavery, Jim Crow, you name it, redlining, you could name it, do they affect conditions today? And then there's a corollary to those questions. The corollary to the first two questions is, if either of the above questions have an answer of yes, are there moral implications for individuals or for institutions? So obviously books and volumes of books and libraries have been written about racial issues, but I ultimately think if we're trying to talk about the racial divide, it really comes down to those three questions. Now, I would submit to you that part of what's happening in our racial discourse is that we focused on the second one, or the third one. We focused on the structures of the past and their connection to today. Or we focused on, given that we know the structures of the past were horrible, is there a moral obligation to do something about that? Now, I think the answer to all these questions is yes. But one of the things you have to face is that people vary on those questions. There are people who say no, no, and no. Most people on this call probably say yes, yes, yes. Racism, you can be racist without intending to. Yes, the structures of the past matter. And yes, there's more implications of that. There are people who say yes, yes, and no. Yeah, you can be, libertarians might say that, for example. But the people who say no, there's no racism. Racism is all conscious animus. The past doesn't matter. It was a long time ago. Stop talking about it. And no, there's no moral obligation. I think that divide really comes down to these questions. Now, what I think we've done is in our persuasive attempts to get people on board, we focused on the second question and the third question. We haven't focused sufficiently on the first question. Some of that's because we didn't know, as clearly as we do now, that you in fact can perpetuate racism without intending to. And that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to focus today on that first question. And I would just argue that one reason it's important is because, and I will get to this, is because you don't have to marshal data to make that point. You don't have to marshal history to make that point. You can just look at your own experience of being a person with a race in society. You can look at your own experience of being a person who sometimes has racially problematic thoughts to get to question number one. So I think that if we're trying to be persuasive to people about racism, we might want to augment our capacity to talk about number one, and that means talking about unconscious bias. Next slide. Our understanding of racism has evolved, especially in the past 50 or so years. As I said, the biggest impediment to racial progress is misunderstanding about this. In the past 50 or so years, there's been a great increase in the understanding that we're not in total control of our thinking, and that there are glitches in our brain that affect our behavior, affect our racial behavior and racial thoughts that we need to be aware of. So what I'm inviting you to do is to become more fluent about talking about this. So that's largely the purpose of today's discussion, to give you some additional resources, ideas, concepts, facts that can help you on your journey to talking about this issue, which is important for your daily interaction with people you know and people you don't know. It's important for your organization's progress, your chapter's progress, your company's progress. It's important to become more fluent talking about it. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to talk about unconscious bias. We have to start out with cognitive priming. And I'm going to share with y'all some findings, just a couple findings about cognitive priming from the area largely of social psychology. One reason I like social psychology experiments is because, especially about unconscious bias, because they're sneaky. because the nature of it is that you have to tell people you're doing this, but you're really doing that, right? And there's something that my evil heart likes about the sneakiness of it. So I'm gonna tell you a few experiments that have to do with that. So next one. So in one experiment, still on college campus, you got people getting paid $15 for an hour of their time. They come to the experiment site, and the task is to read a paragraph, answer a couple questions, go down the hall, do physical tasks. And so in one condition, the paragraph has neutral words: chair, table, ledge, door, etc. Another one, it has words like Florida, bingo, wrinkles, weather, things that imply aging. The word elderly or old are not in the paragraph. And what they're actually testing is whether or not the paragraph affects how long it takes people to walk down the hall. And what they find is that if you read the elderly, the words that prime you for thinking about aging, you walk down the hall more slowly. Over hundreds of people that do this experiment on. So clearly, we're primed to think about elderly or aging. We act.
Lost sound.
Lost sound.
Yeah,
Okay, David seems to be having some kind of technical difficulties. I'm really sorry about that. I'm sure he will be back in just a second. He always has a backup plan. So let me get in touch with him. And if not, I will teach you guys about cognitive priming. One way or another, we will get through this. Okay, he dropped off, so he'll be back in just a second.
Can y'all hear me?
Yeah, we can now, David. You did freeze and stop for a second. So
Hello? I froze out?
you froze out. I'm sorry to tell you, you froze out. And now the camera angle is going straight up at the ceiling, which isn't great. We prefer the other one.
Yeah. Well, the other computer is reconnecting now.
Okay.
So I'm sorry about that. So what was I saying when y'all last heard when I froze out?
The last thing that we heard was you were talking about how slowly people walk when they hear words that associate with aging.
Right. So here's the point. So the point is that when people read the paragraph that was on aging, they walk more slowly, right? And so what's useful to note is that none of the people would have thought that something as irrelevant to the task at hand, which is going down, do a physical task, answer the paragraph, would have affected them, but that it was. And so that's one finding. Okay, could you go to the next slide, Allison? Okay, let me tell you about another experiment. So in this experiment, people come to the site and the door is locked. So they ring the doorbell, and then the assistant comes down and to unlock the door, and they got a little bunch of stuff in their hand. They got their coffee, they got an iPad, they got notes, they got a lot of stuff in their hand. But they're friendly, welcome the person. And they say, okay, we're going to go to the experimental site, which is on the third floor. They go to the third floor. The assistant hands the person a coffee. Let me press the floor to go up. They press the floor to go up. They go to the third floor. They get there, and they're going to go into the experimental room. They read a paragraph that describes a job, and then they read a hypothetical job applicant, and they rate the suitability of the person for the job. What experimenters are testing is whether or not the coffee is iced coffee or warm coffee affects how the person is rated. And what they find is that if you had warm coffee, you're more likely to rate the person as friendly, as smart, and as more suitable for the job. So notice that you would not, there's no relationship between these things, and the people doing the experiment would not have thought that they could be as affected by something as irrelevant as the warmth of the coffee to their assessment of the warmth of the person, but we know that is true. So that's another example. Next slide. Let me give you a third example. This is less of an experiment than more of a study finding. So in this one, they looked at 3,000 medical school applications at the University of Toronto over a 6-year period. And they did an analysis of likelihood of getting in based on various factors. And one thing they looked at was the weather on the day that the application was discussed. And it turns out if your application was discussed on a day that was raining versus a day that was sunny, you had a 10% less chance of getting admitted. So again, something irrelevant to the task at hand. These are, doctors and head of medical schools and all that, and they're still as affected by something as irrelevant to the task at hand as the weather on that day. So if we were in the real world, if I was with you, I so much miss the real world where I could be with you. I would show you that and I would ask the question, what's inside of that? And then you would holler out, pulp, seeds, juice, and all that, because that's what we know is inside of that thing. But, and then I would ask, how do you know that? You've never seen that orange before. And the answer would be, we know that because I've seen oranges before. And what you'd be using is one of the two qualities that are most responsible for humans' domination of the planet. One of them is our ability to cooperate at scale, right? That's how we built the Roman road system and the pyramids and all those things, right? But the second one is our pattern recognition ability. Our pattern recognition ability it beats any other animals by far. So, we can look at one thing and we can make assessments about where that fits in the category of things. It's dusk and we hear rustle in the leaves and we have seen enough to know that we need to leave before the saber-toothed tiger comes to get me, right? So, and those of us who didn't make that conclusion didn't make it. Those descendants, their descendants didn't make it. We have an extraordinary pattern recognition ability, but it's not perfect. It's not without its glitches. And so part of what we're dealing with in the realm of bias is our moments or examples of time or times in which our pattern recognition ability is subject to glitches that don't help us. It's subject to making mistakes. It's subject to confusing the warmth of the coffee with the warmth of the person. Okay. So let us move to the realm of gender bias, unconscious bias grounded in gender. So, so some of y'all might be classical music fans, and look at that. So, let me tell you about some things that happened in the 80s and 90s. It was a recognition that there were more women in fancy music schools than in the prestigious symphonies. And so there's a gap there. So people said, well, I wonder is there gender bias going on? And so people started doing experiments with you have people come out for the audition behind a curtain. So the committee is in front of the curtain and the musician's behind it, and so they don't know. And when you do that, you get a slight increase in the number of women who are selected. Then people realize that women's footfalls is different than men's footfalls because of the kind of shoes men and women wear. So when you have people come out in stocking feet or put a carpet out, you get a significant boost in the number of women who are chosen. Now, the choosers are people who care about the symphony. They're trying to choose they're trying to choose the symphony of their city. Some of those people are women. But the issue is that our bias about who is a qualified musician is strong enough that it affects that choice even below our own awareness. Let me tell you about a study that was done. This study was done with 1,200 people who run labs like this, principal investigators of labs, 1,200 of them, 400 women, 800 men. And basically, they sent each person one resume with a prospective applicant. And those resumes, they sent one to every person, varied by one word, and that's whether it's Jennifer Smith or John Smith. And they had each of the principal investigators to rate the person's competence level on a scale of 1 to 5 and what salary they should get. On competence, there was about a 15% difference between the ratings for the average rating of John and Jennifer. And on salary, there was also about a 15% difference. So this was a general finding throughout the whole population of 1,200 of these principal investigators. So there's enough in this study, there's enough data points where you can actually analyze the men and the women separately. So next slide. So here's my question. My question is, how did the anti-female bias held by the female professors compare to the anti-female bias of the male professors? So Allison, did we prep them for the polling, or is this our first poll we're doing?
This is the first poll that we're doing. So if you could orient them, and I can also put it in the chat, maybe.
Okay.
Actually, it'll be difficult for me to put it in the chat. If you could, everyone could go to menti.com, and if you see, you can do it either on the device that you're watching this on, but I recommend that you do it on your phone. Then you will come up with our polling, you can do it on your phone. Go to a browser, type in menti.com. When you get to the screen, the code is 8007064. And I see one person has gotten in, and you can answer the question, and then we will be able to see the results on this.
So the basic question is, right, was the bias held by the female professors stronger than the ones held by the male, the same as the ones by the males, or were the males the bias by the men stronger than bias by the women? What is the code? The code is 8. Go ahead, Allison.
Go ahead. The code is 8007064. We have 20 people who are taking the poll right now. 22, 23
Look at y'all
figuring it out. So this is
they don't need a warm-up question.
There we go.
These people are on top of it.
Some people are
the question again.
The question is still on the screen, and you'll also see it in Menti. Once you log into Menti, you will see the question, and you'll get to answer there.
The question is, who had the stronger bias against the females, prospective applicants? Was it the women? The women professors had stronger bias. The bias between men and women were equal, or the males had stronger bias? That is the question. Okay, so it looks like there's a strong feeling that the bias by the women was stronger. And this is almost always like it is. And the correct answer is in the middle. It turns out, in fact, that the bias between the males and the females was equally strong. It turns out that was the truth, right? Now, it's interesting that the groups almost always assess like y'all did. And then people say, why is that? You ask people, why is that? And the women are harder on other women. And maybe the women have a kind of a bias because they worked hard and they kind of want to retain their position. So we can speculate about that. But the main point here is that a significant bias against females, and it's not about not liking women. Women have that bias too, at least in this study. And so if we're trying to think about what unconscious bias is, it's important that we let go completely of the idea this is about like not liking other groups. That's not what this is about. It's a different kind of issue. So as we talk about going back to whatever divides in society, we need to make sure that our understanding of whatever ism we're talking about, whether it's sexism or racism or homophobia or whatever it is, it's not about not liking groups. It can be a part of it, but that's not necessarily the dominant thing that's happening. That's the important shift we need to make in terms of understanding how unconscious bias functions. Okay. Racial unconscious bias. So I'm gonna give you all the results of several studies. So one of them was done in the emergency room, first at UCLA hospital. Basically, they looked at people with femur fractures, the longest bone in their body. So you imagine the people are in pain. They looked at people with a certain age group, 15 to 55, injured within 6 hours of the visit, no alcohol involved. And what they found is just under half of the Hispanics received painkillers while they're waiting, whereas 3 out of 4 white folks received painkillers. Basically, after you run various regression analysis on various factors, as you can see there, insurance and time presentation, whatever, being Hispanic was the primary determiner of whether you got painkillers or not. So this is in UCLA Medical School. This is not the KKK Medical School. This is UCLA Medical School. People who want to help humanity. They're going into the medical field to help humanity, but they're affected by something that is irrelevant to the task at hand. Okay, do the same study. 7 years later, Emory University in Atlanta, it's white and black, basically the same result. 74% of the white folks got the painkillers, whereas about 50% of the black folks got the painkillers. So it's the same result. So what's the important shift that we have to make is that this isn't about not liking people. There are people who don't like other people, but that's not what it primarily is about. This is about a kind of messaging that we have absorbed about who is worthy and who is less worthy, who needs to be given a break, who does need to get a break, who's worthy of assistance, who needs a little more chiding, all of that. So it's important to take the whole animus thing, the notion out of it, because that can distract us from the reality of what's really happening. Okay. So let's talk, I want to talk about some other experiments. So let's go to the next slide, Allison. So thanks. So one of the things that social science find is that one way the bias shows up is how we look at children. So both citizens and the police look at Black children as older than white children. So you show people a picture of a child, have them guess their age, and basically people are just as accurate on white and Black children until about age 9. Then it starts to diverge. So that by age 14, there's like a 5-year difference on average. No, I'm sorry, 4-year difference. There's implications of that. One implication of that, I mean, we think about the Tamir Rice case in Cleveland, where the police rolled up on the 12-year-old holding a BB gun, shot him within 2 seconds. We can think about the person who called that in. Who did they think they were calling the police on? When the police got there, who do they think they were dealing with? So this has implications for how we interact with each other. Next one. Other studies have shown that people associate Black names compared to white names with more aggression and less leniency. So you give people a paragraph of some aggressive behavior and have people rate the level of aggression and then what institutions to do about it. And the person is named Deshaun, Trayvon, Jamal, or Xavier, Black sounding names versus white sounding names, Jake, Connor, Wyatt, or Brett. People vary in how much they say, how much aggressive that was, and what's the level of leniency that should be shown on that. Again, we're we're taught certain things, even if we are against our values, and we're subject to interacting with people based on that, and that influences that. And so as we have a discussion about bias, we have to look at that and discuss that in an honest way. So we talked about doctors, we talked about people looking at children. This next study, it's actually two studies, one in Milwaukee, one in Detroit. I mean, Milwaukee and in New York, 25 years apart. They looked at job brokers, people who like their job is to place people in like low skill jobs. And so they sent them resumes and then had rate the suitability for jobs. It was like a 2x2 matrix, 4 conditions. So they got one white person, one black person, and then they vary criminal history. So they have the same background, except in one set they have criminal history and one they don't. Here's what they find. As you would expect, a white man with no criminal history is rated more highly than a white man with a criminal history. Same with a black man. No criminal history is better than having criminal history. Although the deficit, the difference for black men was greater. It's a bigger penalty for that. But the bigger issue is that the white man with a criminal history was rated 7% more suitable for a job than the black man with no criminal history. So again, we're associating, these are job brokers who are not particularly racist as anybody else, but we have an association of blackness with criminality that is below our own awareness. Next slide. Next two studies looked at teachers. So elementary school teachers. So they gave the teachers a description of some behavior that was somewhat problematic, and they had the teachers rate the likelihood that this person will be suspended in the future, to the degree to which this behavior was a problem, and whether this was troubling and warranting of some discipline. And as you might predict by now, if the person has a name like Jamal or some black sounding name, they're more likely to receive more harsh observations than if it was a person who was named Todd. And that's at the elementary school level. When you go up to the graduate school level, you get a similar impact of certain people not getting certain breaks in perception. So they send an email from a fictitious doctoral student to professors asking to meet to talk about going into the program. And white male students received faster and more thorough responses than people of color and even female students in STEM programs and computer science programs. So part of what, again, we have to wrestle with is that this whole issue of bias is kind of pervasive, and it's beneath our level of awareness, and it's not based on disliking people. And this is so important because we're going to really wrestle with it in our organizations, within our practice, within our communities. We have to shift the discourse about this, because for perhaps good reasons, we've associated bias, especially racial bias, we've kind of made it a kind of a social faux pas of the order of a capital crime. And we need to turn it into more of like a second-degree misdemeanor, because as long as we are holding it as a capital crime, it's going to be difficult for us to do the level of admitting of this that's important to do if we're going to wrestle with it in an honest way. And it's going to really be hard for us to persuade people who don't think it's real at all, who think the answer to those 3 questions was no, you can't perpetuate bias unintentionally, no, the past doesn't matter, and no, there's no more obligation. It's going to be really hard to influence those people if we think of bias as something that only really evil, bad people have. And so that's why it's important to become not only fluent, a little bit fluent in these concepts, but the most important thing is to become capable of talking about how bias affects you and has affected you. Okay, let's go back to the deck. So in a new conception of bias, in a broader conception of it, I think it's important that we all ask ourselves hard questions. How does bias affect how I present myself to potential clients? If I'm a mediator, I'm a collaborative professional, I need to ask myself the hard question of how might bias affect how I'm reaching out to people, who I reach out to, who I try to recruit into my services, both at the individual level and at the level of markets and communities. You know, when I went to the IACP, the people were talking about essentially how white that association was and how white people's practices are and how local groups were. And we had a little discussion about why that is and what's the degree to which that is about people not reaching out to some people because of a bias, unfamiliarity, or a basic bias, right? And of course, in the long arc of societal improvement, that's not helping grow the profession, much less it's not helping grow the idea that people can resolve conflicts in a way that doesn't escalate them to court. So we can look at, if you're going to really take the issue of bias seriously, you can ask yourself the question of how does bias potentially, just potentially affect how I interact with clients, or how you assess who you want to partner with. That's important too, right? There are people of color who are mediators or collaborative professionals, but is bias affecting how much I reach out to them and how I do that? That's something that I would encourage people to ask themselves. And that's a hard question. It's easy to think about, oh yeah, there's bias. First of all, a lot of people don't want to think that. But even if you go to that level, bias can become one of those things that affects everybody except doesn't affect me that much. And I would encourage us to shift that and really ask ourselves hard questions. Next slide. Okay. I'm imagining, well, I know that some of y'all are in organizations with other folks, both either professional associations in the collaborative professional arena, or corporations, or what have you. So what I want to spend a little time on is, why is it important to try to counter bias within our organizational life? One pretty consistent finding is that if you can handle diversity well, the more you have of it, the better off you do. And we've seen that in a variety of levels of study. So in one pretty important study, they looked at 400 Fortune 2000 companies. So these are the biggest companies in the world. They looked at the level of diversity in the C-suite and the board. Now, you know, y'all know that in big companies, a friend of mine used to say, it gets maler and paler as you get to the top, right? So we're not talking about domains with a lot of diversity, but there's still, if you look at 400 companies, there's enough diversity, even if there's not a lot of diversity at all, you can make some analytical distinctions between companies. And they put these 400 companies in quintiles of more diverse to less diverse. And they found that the companies in the highest quintile were actually more profitable than the companies in the lowest quintile. So that was that study. Then there was a study by McKinsey. And in this study, looked at public companies, 366 of them, and they found that companies in the top quartile of ethnic diversity were 35% more likely to have financial returns above the industry mean. Gender diversity mattered too. In the top quartile for gender diversity, you have 15% more likely to have returns above the industry mean. So the point here is that more diversity, if you handle it well, leads to higher performance. Next slide. Another study looked at more than 500 companies in the financial crisis of 2007, 2009. So here's the bottom line findings were that the CEOs who had more diversity, gender diversity within their C-suite and their board, they tended to exhibit the less diversity associated with more overconfidence and making decisions more aggressively and more quickly that were not as good decisions. So basically, having more women within the decision-making ranks was better for the companies. Next one. Okay. So the reason why does this happen? Reason is basically summarized here. Without a diverse work population, you're not going to get diversity of thought. Therefore, you're not going to get solutions to meet a diverse client group. Maybe this, to some, this might be obvious, but it bears lifting up. The reason that we have a push for more diversity is because the populations are changing in the world. And so if we're going to have our practice, have our local organization, have our company reflect the realities of our customers and serve the customers better, it's important, it's valuable to have these pushes for diversity. And if we're going to have pushes for diversity, we have to deal with the question of unconscious bias at the level of how do I have it? How do we have it? You and me, and how does our organization have it? And as a part of that, we have to look at our discourse. How do we talk about it? We talk about it in a way that helps us see it more clearly, help us grapple with it, help us get past the shame around it, and help us move forward on it. Next slide. So what the heck's going on here? This is significantly related to stereotypes, clearly. Next one. So one of the, next slide. One of the, yeah, I don't think people are not pushed to do this. So let's skip past that one, Allison. So here's what I want to tell y'all about. I want to commend that y'all take something called the implicit association test. And you can go to projectimplicit.com. It's a test that was created at Harvard, but it's been taken by 22 million people all across the world. Some of you may have heard of it. Basically works like this. Let's just imagine just imagine this for a second. I'll get back to the screen in just a moment. So imagine that you're told that you're going to see a picture of either flowers or feces, and you're given an instruction. An instruction might be, if it's flowers or or feces, you're going to press left as fast as possible. If it's if it's good or flowers, you press the left as fast as possible. If it's bad or feces, press right as fast as possible. So they flash you something, and then you answer accordingly. And it's basically looking at the associations in your head. So you can imagine that if it's good or flowers, press left, and bad or feces, press right. I'm gonna do it at a certain speed. But if they change the instruction to whether if it's good or feces, press left. If it's bad or flowers, press right. I have to look at it, and since those are not associated in my brain, it might take me longer. So that's how the test operates. So then they have you do it 4 times, so you can look at left hand, right hand dominance, and first time dominance, since you're learning a new skill. And this is a widely respected, not universally loved, but widely respected test to look at your level of associations around certain categories of people. So that's how the IAT works. So they have it IATs for race and for gender and for LGBTQ and for body size and age and on, and that's like 14 of them. So I would invite you, when you get a chance, to go to projectimplicit.com, because people often have like a little revelation when they take this test, and they sometimes find out they have biases they didn't expect to have. And it helps advance the discourse about bias by showing people that sometimes you can have a bias you're not even aware of. Okay, we go back to the next slide. So some general findings. shocking, both old and young people have a preference for young people. So again, it's not about animus against groups. Older people like younger people more too, right? They have a more positive association with younger people. A large majority of white people have a moderate or strong preference for white faces, but just less than half of black people have a preference for white faces. So again, it's bigger than like, I don't like those people. It's more insidious than that. Next slide. So I'll just tell y'all about this big study that was done with 10 million words. And they looked at, it's about 10 million words, about the amount of words that people would read in before they went to college. And they looked at how close some words were to other words, and then to see, because maybe that proximity might affect our thinking. And here's what they found. Next slide. They found that the word black was proximate to poor at a really high correlation coefficient, like 0.63, to violent, 0.43, to lazy, 0.40, white, associated with wealthy, 0.48, successful, 0.30, progressive, 0.41. Look at female, associated with distant, mostly distant, 0.37, warm, 0.35. Notice the top two correlation coefficients are about like emotion and relationships, whereas men, dominant or male, dominant 0.46, leader 0.31. So it very well could be that this is 10 million words, that the impressions we get about these categories are influenced by what we are reading. Next one. We can see some of the results of this. This is a readout from about 500,000 people who've taken the test associated, look at male and female associations with career and family. And you can see 24% of people had a strong association of male with career and female with family, whereas in a moderate association of male with career and female with family, 32%. Look at the mirror opposite of that. 2% had a moderate association of male with family, female with career, and 0.3% a strong association of male with family and female with career. And many of the people taking this are career women. So we have to recognize that this is way beyond conscious thought. It's way different than that. So that's an important part of our recognition. It's really an insidious and important factor. Okay. Next slide. So here's what I want to ask y'all. Let's get real about how this impacts you. So here's the question. How many times you've been treated in a way you didn't like due to an identity group you were in, and the person doing it wasn't even aware that they were treating you in a way you didn't like? They basically were operating on unconscious bias. This is a question of how often, how many times has that happened? Okay, so the overwhelming portion are more than I can count. All right, that's cool. That's what usually happens. So now we're going to ask you to get a little even more honest. Next slide. Now we're going to turn it around the other way. How many times have you noticed yourself having biased thoughts or reactions that you were not proud of? Okay, so it's even more. Okay, so we know this is real, right? We know this is real. So one of the things we have to ask ourselves, we don't have a slide on this. We don't have a polling slide on this, but here's what I invite us to look at. And I'll tell you the results when I've done it previously. When I've done this in other groups, this is the answer that you usually get. An overwhelming portion say, of course, that happens a lot, right? Now, typically, or sometimes I ask the question, how many times have you talked about, let's just go racial bias, for example. How many times have you talked about racial bias to somebody who believes that racial bias is a problem? And there's a big shift down from, use the same frequency scale, there's a big shift down to like not as much as I've had these experiences. Because so people have the experiences more than they talk to people about people who are even allies. Like there's a big shift down how often they talk about it. But then when I ask the question of how many times have you talked to people who don't think racism is a problem, people who might be called racism deniers, how many times you talked about your having experienced, you notice yourself having bias, it goes way down. It goes way down because so basically people have these experiences at one level of frequency. They talk about the people who look at racism the same way at a different level of frequency. And then they talk about the people who look at racism differently, way less than that. And so what if there's anything I want to make sure y'all understand, yes, I want y'all to have a understanding around bias and affluence when talking about it. Yes, that's true, but an equally important, if not more important message that I want y'all to get is the importance of talking about bias, especially to people who don't believe it's a problem. If we're going to move people on the belief in racism or not, we have to stop going to statistical proof of it. We have to stop talking about the moral obligation of it, and we have to start talking about, let me tell you about when bias affected me. We need more confession around it. That's hard for people, but it's vital. Just to be clear, polling data tells us that 55% of white folks think that racism against white people is just as important of a national problem as racism against people of color. That's 55% of white folks, about 20% of people of color in different groups. 55% of white folks think that. Now, my personal opinion is that the racial divide in this country is not really people of color and white people. It's is how we think about racism. It's those three questions I said at the beginning, especially around this issue of bias and whether you can unintentionally perpetuate it. That's where the divide really is. That's where the work really needs to happen. And so as you prepare to look at unconscious bias within your own practice, within your own organization, and maybe the nature of who y'all don't have these racism skeptics in your organizations, but you probably have them in your life, especially if you're a white person. And I want to commend that we need to shift how we talk about this. We need to shift to doing more confessing of our own experience of, I often call it white superiority thinking. Let me give you a personal illustration of that. So a couple years ago, I was in Minneapolis, and I was there for a couple of extra days waiting for me to speak about a meeting, and I was walking around like the sky bridges downtown. They have all these sky bridges to let people go between the buildings when it's super cold in Minnesota. And so I'm trying to get my steps in. I need to get back to doing that. And so I'm trying to just going around and turning randomly and just discovering things. So there's not that many black people. So I'm walking like this, and there's other guys coming this way, younger guy. He kind of looks, a lot of like Somali type of people in there. And he had that look. So I'm trying to like do the nod, say the hi thing, and he didn't really acknowledge me. So I was kind of looking at him probably more than I should. So I'm looking at him, and I noticed, he he has like an empty backpack, but it's kind of empty. So, okay, he didn't say hi, whatever. So I keep walking. And then a little while later, I turn around and I notice that he's walking in my direction now. Something that's interesting. He's walking the other direction before. Okay, whatever. So I'm doing my steps. I make a turn. I'm walking. And then I turn back and the dude is behind me again. I'm like, what is going on with this? Okay, it's nothing, whatever. So I'm just doing walking. I made another turn and then the dude's still behind me. So, so I'm like, okay, why is a Somali terrorist dude stalking me? What is going on with his diet? Why is his backpack empty? What's he got going on? I went through all of this, right? So I decided to take evasive maneuvers. So I stepped to the side. I started checking. I checked my phone. I get no message. So I let the dude go by. And then he goes by, and on the same little block we're on, he turns into like a luggage store, and he has like a big greeting with this other Somali-looking guy, and he's clearly brought his backpack to get fixed. Now, I done turned this dude into a criminal. I done made him out to be a terrorist, and he's just a young Somali dude who didn't say hi to me, right? So the same thing that I did to him, turn him into some criminal, like that's happened to me, right? So the issue that what I'm trying to do by telling you is to try to model the kind of disclosure and confession around these issues that we're going to need if we're going to shift the discourse in our country and maybe even in our organizations. Even if you have people in your organizations when you're setting who think unconscious bias is an issue, it is a high likelihood that they're going to say it's an issue generally, not an issue for me. And what I'm saying is that an important step is to think about moments in which the moments you already said you have, where you had thoughts you were not proud of, and start talking about them. We need to shift how we talk about these issues to take it seriously, but take the sting out of it, right? That's important to do. And one important way to do that we can all do is to start talking about it, to start confessing about it, to give examples of it, not from statistics, not from books, not from what we saw on TV, but from our own personal life. I think if we can do that, it's going to significantly aid our collective grappling with this issue that is holding us back and keeping us from having a world that works well for everybody. So I want to, knowing that I usually go too long and crowd out the questions, I want to stop here and see if there are any questions or comments that will be useful for us to take. How are we gonna do that, Allison? We got a mechanism for that?
Sure. I will be happy to pull some questions out of the chat. One of the first questions we had that rolled through the chat that I answered, but you can give your take on it because we don't always necessarily agree, do we, David?
Exactly.
Is unconscious bias and implicit bias, are those interchangeable?
I don't know what you said, Allison, but my answer would be yes. Did you have a better answer?
No, we're batting.
Oh, look at that.
1,000 right here. Okay. And then the next, then there was some discussion about why would women be biased against women? And I put a comment in the chat, and maybe you could speak more to this about the anti-Black bias that is ubiquitous and has to be navigated, especially by parents of color.
Right. I mean, yeah, I mean, so part of the, okay, so the question is, why would some groups have a bias against their own group? And that's kind of what I'm trying to make sure y'all understand, is that part of what's going on with bias is that we're trained by both the words we read, images we see on TV and in the movies, by our actual experiences, by what other people tell us, especially authority figures when we're younger. All of that trains us and becomes a filter through which we absorb our experiences. And so if given that there's a long history of sexism, like the entire history of the planet, right? And given that there's a long history of anti-Black thinking / white superiority thinking, it should not be surprising that women can absorb the male superiority thinking, and people of color can absorb the white superiority thinking. It's all part of. It's not about our conscious. It's not about our conscious decisions. Exactly. We can make a conscious decision to try to fight against it, but I'm not responsible for what my mama taught me when I was 5, right? I'm not responsible for that. I'm not responsible for the books. I talked about that study, the Beagle study, the study of the 10 million words. I'm not responsible for that. But if over the course of my youth, again, 10 million words, the amount that an average college student has read, if I see a correlation between Black and poor, or Black and lazy, or female and emotion, it should come as no shock that I might have an association, even if I'm not doing that study. I'm not consciously documenting that, but I'm absorbing that. Again, it's a pattern recognition ability. My mind is absorbing those patterns, even below my level of awareness.
Right.
That answers the question.
Yeah. Thanks so much. We also had a question about what if you confess and the so-called biased person says, huh, too bad for you. That's not the case for me. And they continue to deny that they are exhibiting some kind of biased behavior.
That is possible. There's no question that that's possible. So I guess the question would be, so no question that's possible. I guess here's what I invite you to consider. First of all, by admitting bias, you're doing something very countercultural, and it might make people uncomfortable. And it very well could be that if you, they might deny it at the moment, but admit it later. Now, but there's another wrinkle I need to point out. You got to look at your own energy when you do it. If your energy is an accusation energy, you can still do a confession, but you're really doing an accusation. Let me tell you about a story. I'm biased to make you believe that you biased too. You could tell it like that, or you could tell, like, I'm telling you a story about how I'm biased. I'm just wondering whether you ever think you might be, right? So even if you know you are, you might not. Having the accusation energy is only creates defensiveness. Now, my first comment was that people can still be in denial. Of course, that's true. And sometimes your initial conversation isn't the last time they thought about it, especially if you make the invitation an actual invitation and not a subtle accusation. But if you're asking, is it possible for you to admit to somebody that you're biased and they walk away and forever think that they're not, that is of course possible. There's no question that's possible.
Of course it is. Yeah, some pancakes can't be flipped, right?
You're quoting Dr. Eddie Moore of the White Privilege Conference. Exactly.
I'm an avid student. I love to eat this stuff up. Okay. So there was another really good question about, can we talk a little bit about the double whammy of being a person of color and also being a woman, and how does the intersectionality of that come into play in terms of bias? Or do you want me to take that one?
Well, neither of us are in a good position to answer that question.
but together we can get a great answer.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I just think that we need to understand systems of oppression and what people have to go through in order to throw off the system of oppression and find their voice and then show up as their authentic self. And that burden is doubly difficult for women of color because they're fighting all of the stereotypes of being a woman, and no matter what move they make there, they are then fighting the stereotypes of being a person of color. And so it's this this dance of going through all of the minefields of both of those things. And then if you layer on top of that a sexual orientation or a gender identity thing, it becomes almost impossible. And so a lot of the wisdom these days is to really listen to the people who have traveled that road. They have so much to teach us.
Right. I mean, so on a basic level, yes, the more categories you're in of marginalization, the harder life can be. I don't think there's no way around that. So, um, but I think what Allison said is right about we need to listen to folks because like there's wisdom in that experience. So yes, it's just harder, right? The more, you could be a Black woman who's also disabled, right? And we could go down that list in terms of intersectionality. There's no question all of that stuff is true. And it's funny, life is not, there's many aspects of life that are not fair. But let me tell you about two things that relate to this. So sometimes on diversity trainings, I use something called the diversity wheel. You might have seen, you can look it up, and a lot of people use it. Basically, it looks at different levels of diversity, some of which you cannot control, like age, gender for the most part, race, etc. Then there's ones you have some control over, but not that much, like language. Your language use is significantly influenced by whether you learned a second language as a kid. Your religion is significantly influenced by what you're supposed to as a kid, and then there's things you choose, right? And so oftentimes I have people in the diversity training context like rate which of these are most salient to them, and then rate which have been aids to their progress in life and which have been impediments. And then I have people rate if they could come back for a second life, which would they want to hold on to? And oftentimes, even these, when people are a victim, people are part of groups that are systematically marginalized, they still would choose to be that again because it's a part of their identity, and there's wisdom that they've learned in that, and they would want to hold on to that if they had a chance to choose life over again. Now, let me add an additional point to that, and it relates to the issue of how we talk about racism. So the Dialogue Company has an initiative called the White Ally Toolkit, which focuses on helping especially white people who think racism is real, about 45% of white people, talk to white people who don't think racism is real, about 55% of white people. And so we have books and online courses and courses with cohorts. We have one coming up in January. If you go to the dialoguecompany.com, you can learn about our course that I'm doing with Allison called Doing My Part as an Anti-Racism Ally, which is you go through 4 sessions to learn our method of having these kind of conversations. One of the things that I have talked about in one of my books, I have a book called Compassion Transforms Contempt, is that one of the things that that Black people have come to learn is, and again, it's not true for everybody, but it's a general wisdom, is there's a difference between what you feel and what you do. So like, for example, like the whole notion of the talk where like, yes, you're subject to a police stop and it's important, and parents are telling their kids that you're going to be subject to unfairness and you need to make some good choices in that moment. So you can't always lash out because you're being treated unfairly. You need to be strategic. Now, why Black people learn that? They learn that because of 350 years of oppression, where if you lash out at the master or the oppressor, you could have some severe consequences. So that truth, that there's a distinction between what you feel and what you do, and you can make choices from that place, is important wisdom that some people have learned. Now, I'm contrasting that to a whole bunch of white folks who, when dealing with somebody who is racially problematic, they're like, I can't deal with that. They make me so mad. And I'm like, are you committed to trying to change them or not? Because if you are committed to that, then it's important for you to grab hold of that place inside of yourself that says, I really don't like this person is coming from, but I'm committed to a longer term goal of changing them. And so I'm going to adopt a stance of compassion. And we have various steps that you need to take. But the point is, you can go to a place where you're not just reacting to the world, because you have learned, like a lot of white folks have not, like it's a privilege to be in a situation where like your reaction just works, right? If you're not in that group and you've learned that your reaction just doesn't work, you have to get a different relationship to it. That's a source of wisdom. So the point of all that is that it is harder being in marginalized groups, but there's wisdom that you learn from that, which is part of the reason why, as Allison said, it's important to listen to people who are in marginalized groups you're not in, because there's things that they might know that's useful for you to learn.
And so let's see, there's some great stuff happening in the chat. I will also invite anyone who would like to unmute at this time and ask a question themselves. We
You
can
need to put it in the
probably,
chat. Somebody asked about the course, Allison. We need to put that in the chat. I'll do
okay.
it. Yeah, put all our stuff can be gotten on the dialoguecompany.com. So
yes, the the tips on how to work with diversity and respect and listen when you have it in a group or in a situation.
So here's a couple tips. One of the things that we suggest to people is they practice their listening tips before they're in situations that are really tense. So if you were to take the Doing My Part course, for example, again, it starts in January. Well, one of the first exercises is to like choose a listening tips and relaxation method, and then practice that when you're not in a situation where you're talking to somebody who has very different views of racism or anything else. Just like, okay, today I'm going to practice. I'm going to ask somebody about their experience. Somebody who likes Indian food and I don't like it. You know, I'm going to ask them about that. Say, what is your experience with Indian food? I'm going to practice asking, and before that asking, I'm going to practice relaxing so I can, and then think about what's going to help me listen. So my point is that the skill of listening and the skill of asking questions, those are skills, and we can practice them. And especially asking questions about experiences. One of the things that we teach is that you want to move a conversation from a conversation, especially with somebody who has different beliefs about some issue like racism. You want to ask a question that goes underneath their beliefs. So you don't want to stay at the belief level. You want to ask questions about their experience, because experience conversations are more connecting, and people listen to you more if you listen to them first. So the point I'm making is that the skill of learning to relax, you know, and people have practiced techniques where they like, they know they're going to be a tense conversation. They can go, they say, excuse me for a second, I'm going to the bathroom, and they go do their listening, relaxing technique before they come back and enter that. So you have to have practiced that. It's helpful you have practiced that. If you have practiced skills of listening, if you practice skills of asking questions, then you're more likely to be able to do that in a group situation. Just one more thing about the group situation, in almost any situation, but even in a group, asking questions about people's experiences can be helpful in shifting the conversation to be less conflictual, because now people are sharing stories as opposed to just batting heads on beliefs.
So we are very close to the end of our time, Dr.
Well, I
Campt.
gotta say, before you say it, I got to tell people about our new thing. So our new thing is, we just came out this week. So in advance of the holiday difficulty coming up, holiday period, I know a lot of people are facing, even though we're trying to socially distance, a lot of people ain't. You're still gonna be around family members. So we have something called the Holiday Survive and Thrive Guide, which is on our website, which is like a video course to give you some 27 tips about how to navigate those situations if you're going to be around somebody who has very, very different beliefs than you have. So you're invited to go check that out as you check out our Race Method 101 course, which is our method of teaching how to talk about race. And as you especially check out, as you go to our website, our course in January, which people have told us they like it so much, it not only helps them talk about racial issues, but it also improves their lives generally. And improves it. People told us, Allison, how like it's made my marriage better. The techniques they learned in that course.
I think the best resource for that is the book that you and I wrote together.
Oh, and then there's the book. And then there's the book. And then there's the book.
This is how the journey with Dr. Campt and I started a couple of years ago. We really do believe that that this work is so personal that that we can frame it almost as a spiritual journey. If you're not a person of faith, I think that you will still find that book inspirational and relevant. It's not sectarian at all. It is very just inspirational, and it was an incredible learning experience for me to do that with Dr. Campt. So we are at the end of our time. As was said at the beginning of our time together, this is the first part of a multi-part effort on the part of your organizations to really embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to be anti-racist. There is a difference between simply not being racist and knowing that racism is bad, and moving into being anti-racist, to where you are addressing all forms of barriers for all marginalized people. And that is the hard work that is ahead of us. And we are so excited to be on this journey with all of you.
So let me just say one thing just to clarify. So we are very grateful for this opportunity. And we're going to do some extended work with some folks in the Boston area. And I'm looking forward to that. And so if other folks want to engage us, obviously Allison and I like doing this. So if you want us to appear other places, we love to do it. We would love to. We'd actually love to come see you, but we ain't doing that for a while. But still, we think it's so important that the message be spread about that we can change our society, we can heal the divisions, and we know the divisions just got worse, right? But it is all the more important that we develop our own personal capacity, our own institutional capacity to wrestle with these issues and to talk about them well. So we really thank you for this opportunity, and let us know if we can be of further assistance to you.
And a huge thank you to Beth Ahrens, who got this rolling and has helped us work out the details. It is complicated to get organizations working together to share resources and bring everything together. So big salute to you, Beth Ahrens. And Justin Kelsey and Michael Arrett, who are leading the way with their organizations. Thanks everybody for joining us. And we hope to see you all soon. Take care.